In this video, I'm going to be taking my new Primaris Marines and giving them the good old retro makeover. I'll be grabbing some old school heads, some new shoulder pads to make them even extra Ultramarine, and then pulling out an old retro colour scheme that I've got from my original Space Marine collections. So recently I have gotten well and truly hooked on Warhammer 40k, and with all the hype around 10th edition, I don't know, I've just kind of fallen for all the marketing stuff. I just, I'm human, I can't be helped. So amongst all the hype, I ended up picking up a few Primaris Marines, so I went onto eBay, picked up a few sets, and I've got them all shipped over. And I got them all unpacked and started gluing them all together, but there was something missing from these. When deciding on some of my old 3D printed stuff, what sort of colour schemes to go for, I ended up going with this like red and blue, and I quite liked it. And it was at this point that I realised I really wanted to go for the old retro look of that like bright yellow trim and bright yellow on the chest, and then the big red guns and all of that. So I had the colour scheme in mind already. But then my friend James pointed out something to me, that the old heads looked so much better, and that's where it stood out to me, that those old like Stormtrooper-esque type heads really do stand out. So I went off and I grabbed a few files and had a bit of a play around to see what would work with these. So using my 3D printer, I printed off a whole bunch of different heads as well. And I got a few old beaky heads as well, because we need to mix up the old classic stuff with the new stuff. Once all of that was printed off, I started sticking it all onto my Primaris Marines, and they were already starting to come together, but they needed a little bit more Ultramarine. So I printed off the shoulder guards as well, which went on there. They've got the Ultramarine symbol on it, which makes it easier for me not to have to freehand, because that's never going to go well. At this stage, I was happy with how they were looking. I had obviously the main bulk of the Primaris Marine, which I do quite like the look of, and then I had some of those old school flavours thrown into the mix as well. And now it was onto the painting stage. Now, painting up these Space Marines was actually pretty easy, and there's loads of different ways to paint power armor, loads of different guides out there as well. But for me, I just sprayed them all black with my airbrush, and then I went back in with a good old dry brush. And I've got to say, I really like how power armor takes that dry brushing. It just really picks up a lot of those colors and really play around a lot with those highlights. I started off with Macragge blue, so that really deep dark blue all over the Marine wherever I could get it. And this gave obviously a really nice step up from that black that was underneath it, but it's still keeping some of that black in there. Next, I went for a Kaldor Sky and started popping that over there just to lighten it up and bring up some of those areas. And then a Calgar blue all over it as well. The good thing about that Calgar blue is it kind of knocks it down a little bit and takes some of that saturation out and just gives you that more traditional like ultramarine look. Next up, I went a little bit mad with Fenrisian Grey, and this is great because it really helps for that edge highlighting and to add some really bright highlights. Now, what you want to do with this is you do want to take it quite high, and it will look a little bit crazy at this stage because you'll have a lot of that grey all over it. But don't worry, we're going to knock it back in a little bit. However, you do want to take those highlights as bright as you possibly can, and then it's worthwhile going back in there with like a white or a cream and just catching some of those real top edges that you want to be the absolute brightest. Once all the dry brushing was done, it was time to go on for like a bit of a glaze to knock back some of those highlights and to really blend it all together. Now for this, I use Speed Paint High Lord Blue and also Speed Paint Medium. I work it at around about 1 drop of High Lord Blue to like 3 drops of that Speed Paint Medium, and it makes a really nice glaze that you can then slosh all over it. Great thing is, it darkens back down all those shadows, it brings down all of those highlights and makes them a really nice bright blue, and it blends all of those layers as well. Anywhere where you might have some of that chalkiness left over as well from your dry brushing, the great thing about this is it just helps to kind of almost like reactivate it and take away a lot of that chalky texture. At this stage, you could probably leave it, but I go back in there with a dry brush of Calgar Blue just to knock some of those colours back down a bit and just make it look a little bit more ultramarine-y. Otherwise, it does look a little bit too like this, I don't know, quite a vivid blue, whereas we want this almost like muted blue instead. And once you've got the colour down to how you like it, then I went back in there and did some edge highlights using Fenrisian Grey. For all of the weapons, I went in there and I used Mephiston Red, and I used that for the captain's helmet as well. And then for the real fun bit, which is like all of the shoulder panels, the chest Aquila, just anywhere where I wanted that yellow to be on them, I used Avalon Sunset. And I've got to say, this actually came out really nicely. I thought, looking at the pot and the colour that I was getting in the pot, and once I put it onto like my wet palette and everything else, it looked as though it was going to be a little bit more of a browny yellow, but it makes a beautiful base for this type of thing, especially for the chest piece. You can go back in there if you want to and use a lighter yellow to brighten it up, but actually in the end I didn't bother with that. So for any parts that were going to be metal on the weapons, on like the chainsaw for example, or parts of the bolter, I used Runefang steel, and that just helped to really kind of add some nice metallics on there and just make it stand down. For the Ultramarine symbol on the shoulder guard, I used Wraithbone, and this was quite a real nice white. I expected that I was going to go back in there and have to do a lot of brightening with this, but it just worked in my opinion. Once that was done, I wasn't too sure what to do. I was really liking the way the power armor looked and how everything else looked, but they needed some kind of shade. Now, I don't like using traditional washes just because they can really knock down the colours a lot. They're fine on fantasy minis, but sometimes they can really dull your paint job. So I went in there with an oil wash. Now, if you haven't seen me do an oil wash before and you're new to the channel, it's really simple. You literally take the colour that you want to be oil washing, basically pop some white spirits into a little cup, add a little bit of the colour that you're going to need and mix it all together. Now, you want to test out the consistency of this to make sure that it runs nicely and go from there. For this, I was using a nice black, so that would get into all of those panels and really help with the panel lining side of things. Now, some people do suggest to use a varnish before you get onto this stage. I never do, I'm lazy, and I've never had any issues with those layers beneath it reactivating when I come in to clean them up. So you slosh that oil wash that you've made all over your models and just get it in there. Don't worry about going too heavy with this because you can go back in there and clean it. And then leave it for about 15 to 30 minutes and then go back in with like a makeup Q-tip or a little sponge, and you can start taking off all of those high areas that you don't want it. So for example, on the top of the shoulder guards, on the top of the helmet, we don't want this pooling left all over. So I just went back in there, cleaned it all up, and then you're pretty much good to go. Once it's all dried, if you've still got any areas that do stand out, like they've got too much pooling, for example, or too much staining, you can go back in there and use some white spirits on the makeup Q-tip and then just dab it on. And the great thing about this is it reactivates that oil wash that you've put on there, and it can remove pretty much any of the staining. It's a really nice wash to work with. Takes a bit of practice, but once you get it down, it means that you've got pretty much full control over where that color ends up. And it just really helped me to add some of that panel lining. Once that was done, I was pretty much happy with all of my Marines. I went back in there and I did a little bit of highlighting. So with the yellow, I went back in with the same base color that I'd used and just touched up some of those areas that maybe had a little bit too much staining that I hadn't taken care of well enough, or I wanted to make the colors pop just a little bit more. With the reds, I went back in there and I just lightened some of those areas up as well and had a little bit of edge highlighting, and then I was pretty much done. There's a couple of things on these models that I'm not massively happy with. The banner, for example, although I printed that off and added it just to make it that old school retro banner, I'm not entirely sure what on earth I was doing with it, and I didn't figure out the colors, so they don't look great. They look okay, but I certainly would need to go back in there and fix it. And then also for the green for the lenses, not a massive fan. I don't dislike them, but I also don't like them. So maybe going back in there and replacing them with red instead when I move on to my next batch of Marines. But that's them done. And I've got to say, I am really, really happy with these. They're some of my favorite miniatures that I've done in quite some time. And I don't know if that's just nostalgia kicking in or it's that they actually look good. I have no idea. Let me know in the comments below. I really like this color scheme. I'm not a massive fan of the Ultramarine gold and blue, but I love that old Ultramarine style of the blue and then the really bright yellows. It's so like over the top, but also just like a trademark thing of them, and I love it. And I think it translates really well to these Primaris Marines with that old retro helmet and just some other parts as well. In my next build, I'm probably going to go even more over the top with it, so I'll see what I can find and 3D print and then stick all over Marines, and let's just have a little bit of fun with them. So now I will leave you with some B-roll of these Marines, and I'll also throw in some B-roll of my old Marines that my dad painted for me that got me into the hobby back in the day. I have a whole bunch of these and they're a load of fun. And again, they're that over-the-top blue with a lot of yellow on them. And they're really, really glossy. Apparently gloss varnish was a massive thing back in the day. Yeah, my Marines aren't getting that because otherwise they're gonna burn my eyes out when any light hits them. So I hope you've enjoyed that video, and if you have, hit the like and subscribe button, come along for some more content in the future, and let me know what would you like me to see retrofy next, if that's a word, because I want to build out my Space Marine army along with some other 40k armies to use with 10th edition. So let me know what sort of Space Marine units you'd like me to get, maybe 3D print some parts, maybe do some kit bashing for, to make them retro and to also make them in that retro style. I'm having a lot of fun with this, far too much fun, and it's most likely going to bankrupt me. So I will see you in the next one. Take care and see you soon. Bye.